introduce Jerr Boschee. Jerr has been an advisor to social entrepreneurs in the U.S. and elsewhere for 30 years. He's been a senior marketing executive for a Fortune 100 company, managing editor for a chain of regional newspapers, and a Peace Corps volunteer in India. Jerr is the former president and CEO of the National Center for Social Entrepreneurs. He's one of 6 co-founders of the Social Enterprise Alliance, and was named by the nonprofit Times to the Power and Influence Top 50 list 3 different times. He served from 2001 to 2004 as an advisor to England's Department of Trade and Industry. He also has authored and edited 5 books. Jerr is currently the executive director of the Institute for Social Entrepreneurship, which he created in 1999. He is also a board chair for Encore Service Corps, an international nonprofit that he co-founded in 2003 to send former Peace Corps volunteers and others back into service on short-term assignments that match their professional expertise with specific social needs. He has long been recognized as one of the founders of the social enterprise movement. We're excited to have with us here today, Jerr Boschee.
Thanks, Elke. Now that you're acquainted with my checkered career, let me tell you how it all began. About 40 years ago, I was sitting in a chair very much like the one you're in now, trying to decide what to do with my life. As you well know, we grew up in a very different world than the one you're growing up in. I'm not even a boomer. I'm a pre-boomer. I was born during the Second World War, which has always been a touchstone for me, and I didn't realize how much of a touchstone it was going to be until I was 22 years old. Very few people in my generation had the chance to travel the world. And of course, there was no internet. It was a very different time and place. But for some reason, I had this impulsion to want to go to Europe. It was something that just, I don't know where it came from. And it certainly wasn't shared with most of my fellow high school students or my fellow college students. But it was something that really drove me. And in the fall of 1967, I actually did it. I just got on a plane and went. And I wound up in Munich. I don't know how much you folks know about the Second World War, but you certainly know about the Holocaust. And yet I was a very naive young man. I had grown up in a German Catholic ghetto in South Minneapolis. We'd moved out to a very sequestered suburb. There were only 200 students in my entire high school with 4 grades. Even going to the University of Minnesota was an awakening for me to a larger world. And heading to Europe was an even greater awakening, because on my second day there, and I find it difficult even to talk about now, on my second day there, I found myself at Dachau. And I began to see the roots of human evil. And it drew out of me a desire to make a difference somehow, to go somewhere. 2 weeks later, I was in Amsterdam. And I found myself in the Anne Frank house, learning the story of this young girl who had survived almost until the end of the war, before they were captured, taken to the concentration camps, and disappeared. I came back to the United States. I knew I wanted to do something that would add to this world rather than subtract from it. And I wasn't sure what I could do. And that winter, I spent a lot of time railing against the U.S. government because it was Vietnam escalation time. And many people my age were objecting in one way or another. And every Friday night, I would go out with a group of friends, and we would complain and kvetch and bitch about what was going on and why didn't anybody do it differently? Why didn't somebody fix it? Finally, one of my friends stopped me cold and he said, "Jerr, if you really feel that way about it, why don't you do something about it?" The next week, I applied to join the Peace Corps. And 3 months later, I left for India. And an entirely new world opened up for me again, working with 12 and 13-year-old boys in a village in rural India, trying to help them see that they had options in their lives, not American options, but options in their context. And all of this was roiling inside me as the years went by, as I tried to find a way that I could bring whatever talents I had to bear on social problems, social needs, doing something to help other people. I came back and returned to my career as a journalist. I became the managing editor for a chain of newspapers. But then another one of those serendipitous things happened in somebody's life. I learned through a friend about a corporation in Minneapolis that was beginning to focus on education and health care in an attempt to do something about them. It was called Control Data Corporation, which was the darling of Wall Street in the late 50s and early 60s, the most successful computer company during the 1960s. And by the late 70s, we had more than 60,000 employees. But I didn't know any of that. All I knew was that this company was trying to do something about education and health care. So I wrote to a friend there and said, I'd like to learn more about this. And to make a long story short, after about 6 months, I wound up going to work there. And 18 months later, the chairman of the organization, completely out of the blue, plucked me to be his aide in all matters dealing with the media worldwide. And I traveled with him for 4 years as he did about 300 speeches all over the world, and he did about 100 major media interviews, electronic and print, all over the world, all talking about a subject that was brand new. We didn't know what it was called then. It didn't take its name until many years later. But Bill Norris, the founder of Control Data Corporation, is the man who really invented social enterprise. And I was so fortunate to spend that time with him in the early days of the evolution of the movement. Philanthropy. 100 years ago, when our benefactor here, Andrew Carnegie, was the leading philanthropist in the country, had an arm's length relationship with what a business would do. Carnegie's motto was to make as much money as he could and then give it away. And he even said in his autobiography that knowing as a young man that he was going to try to make a lot of money and then give it away allowed him to be even more rapacious in his business dealings so he could make more money. But eventually, he began endowing hospitals and libraries and all of the things we know him for. But there was a gap between how he made his money and how he did his philanthropy, and he viewed them as good works. And that was the way American philanthropy had been established. Until about 30 or 40 years later, in the 1920s, Julius Rosenwald, the head of Sears Roebuck, changed the formula. Rosenwald realized that if there was going to be a future for Sears 10, 20, and 30 years down the road, there had to be a healthy rural economy, because that's where the Sears market lay, in rural America. So he began to address corporate resources toward improving rural America. He helped create the County Extension Service in the United States and endowed 100 of them across the country in the second decade of the century. He helped start the Campfire Boys and Girls. He helped start Boys and Girls Clubs of America. Everything he did and that he had his executives do and that they put corporate money into was intended to increase the health of rural America. So the gap was closing between what they did as a business and what they would do philanthropically. But there was still a gap between them. He viewed them really as sunk costs in the future of his company. And that's the way American philanthropy began to evolve for another 30 or 40 years until Bill Norris came along. In the summer of 1967, our cities were burning. Riots were taking place all over the country. Norris looked out there and he said, "What can we do to help?" He sent his senior executives out into the inner cities to find out what is it people needed that could prevent this from happening again. They all came back and said, it's very clear that what people need are jobs. That's the root of any personal self-worth, any dignity, any self-sufficiency. So Norris said, okay, build a plant in the inner city and do it right now. And he wound up building 5 plants in 5 inner cities and in 2 distressed rural communities in the late 60s. But it prompted him to think about his role in the world in a different way. And he began to develop a process and a motto and an approach that can be encapsulated very, very smoothly. It says, our mission, he said, is to address the major unmet needs of society as profitable business opportunities. In other words, he closes the gap entirely between what a corporation is doing to make money and what a corporation is doing to address social needs. And I traveled with him for years as he talked about this theme. And corporate executives, government officials, media, everybody around the world would sit and listen, and they would applaud, and very few of them would do anything about it. Meanwhile, Control Data was applying computer technology to urban revitalization, rural revitalization, creating jobs for prisoners, doing work with caribou herds in Alaska and beyond, working with the first small business incubators in the country. Control Data and RPI were the two that set up the first ones. Getting into healthcare on the Native American reservations, using computer technology to improve healthcare. I mean, one thing after another. Gradually, the private sector began to see what was going on. It took a while. But if you go back to the 1970s, you'll see the private sector beginning to address social needs through their businesses. 30 years ago, nobody thought that dealing with the environment could create a business opportunity. And yet if you look around today, there are thousands of businesses working in the environment. There are hedge funds specializing in the environment. I probably shouldn't talk about hedge funds these days. But there's all sorts of financial mechanisms to help stimulate investment in addressing environmental problems. That started in the 70s. We started seeing adult daycare centers. We started seeing rehab centers. We started seeing home modification businesses. We started seeing hospice centers. We started seeing a whole range of things that the for-profit sector had never thought about before, that had been left to the government or hopefully to nonprofits to do. And they were finding ways, in Peter Drucker's terminology, to do good and to do well at the same time. What did the nonprofit sector do in terms of reacting to that? Almost everybody in the sector was appalled. They felt it was illegitimate. It was making money off the backs of the poor. It was concentrating on serving just a few people who could afford to pay and not those who couldn't afford to pay. It was sacrificing quality for some bottom line. There were a million reasons to say no. And for 30 years, the nonprofit sector remained frozen in place, except for a few pioneers that I'll tell you about. Until the pressures on the sector began to become so strong that a tectonic shift of attitude began to take place. The cost of running nonprofits escalated dramatically after the recessions of the 1970s. The amount of money flowing from government began to flatten during the Reagan administration, when the message was, let's get government off our backs and turn responsibility for delivering social services over to the nonprofit sector. But not all the money came with it. So the costs were up, the resources were down. The number of nonprofits squabbling over the money that existed tripled in the last 30 years, tripled in this country. And the pool wasn't getting any larger of available resources. The number of people in need escalated. Think of the things we weren't dealing with 30 years ago. HIV/AIDS, homelessness, crack babies. The list just goes on. Just open the newspaper any day and you'll see the challenges that we're all confronting. Some nonprofits began to understand there was a way to combine the best of the for-profit sector with the best of the nonprofit sector and address these social needs and at the same time become increasingly financially viable as an organization. And social enterprise began to take on greater cachet than it had. But still, people would come to my seminars and my workshops and stalk out in the middle of it and leave notes behind that I would read to the rest of the group, and it would say, this is the most evil thing I have ever heard. The attitudinal barriers within the nonprofit sector were significant, still are. But things are changing. There are three models, are there not, by which a nonprofit can support itself? And historically, the dependency model has been number one. Every year, knock on the doors of the foundations, the individual donors, the government, and ask for money to cover your expenses for that year to carry out your program. Every year, starting over again. If you're lucky, maybe you get a 2-year grant, but that doesn't happen all that often. And that's what the nonprofits did, up almost till the 90s. But there are two other models out there. One is a sustainability model. Traditionally, nonprofits have been funded by contributions and by government subsidies. And that's a two-legged stool. Two-legged stools tend to tip over, don't they? The smart nonprofit people, board members, executives in the 90s began to add a third leg to that stool called earned revenue. And a sustainability strategy for a nonprofit combines all three of those. It's a mixed revenue stream. A three-legged stool is much more firmly planted on the ground. If grants are down one year, maybe subsidies can go up. If they're both down, maybe earned revenue can go up. If earned revenue is down, you go to one of the other. You've got more options. And when I say earned revenue, I'm not necessarily talking about being driven entirely by earned revenue. I've worked with a lot of United Ways and a lot of nonprofits all over the country, and they've essentially said, if a nonprofit can increase the percentage of its budget that's covered by earned revenue by 15% in 1 to 3 years, that's a significant change. So if you're a nonprofit with a $100,000 budget, what we're saying is there's probably $15,000 in earned revenue you haven't found yet. For some nonprofits, that's an easy advance. For others, it's tough. But every nonprofit in the world, in my estimation, should be looking at this type of a mixed revenue stream to help move it closer to sustainability. The third model is one that only a few nonprofits should ever attempt, and that's the self-sufficiency model, which is driven entirely by earned revenue, no longer dependent on grant or government subsidies. It's tough to do. It's very tough to do. For those who are successful at it, they can make significant changes in the world in which they live. But it's not easy. And a lot of what's happened in the nonprofit sector is that as people have begun to understand what this is about, they've tried to leap immediately to the self-sufficiency table, and they fall short. And then they feel that the whole process has been discredited. Actually, what most nonprofits need to do is start with small steps. And you know what the first step, my students here are not allowed to answer the question because they already know the answer, but do you know what the first step that a nonprofit should take if it wants to be entrepreneurial? You know what that step might be? They have to learn how to kill programs. The first step in entrepreneurship is getting a sharper organizational focus and stop trying to be all things to all people. We know why nonprofits do that, right? Somebody's in pain, so we start a program. Somebody else needs help, so we start another program. Somebody else raises their hand, so we start another program. They need help, so we start another program. I've traveled all over the world lecturing about this to nonprofit leaders all over the world, and I can't tell you how many of them come up to me afterwards and draw me aside and say, we're trying to be too many things to too many people. We're spread too thinly. We don't have the resources. We don't know what to do. Help. What can we do? And I tell them what Drucker said years ago, you must learn how to kill programs. Many of them recoil, but some of them don't. And they begin to take that first step down the path toward being genuinely entrepreneurial and figuring out how they can be great at something rather than just okay at a lot of things. And there's a lot of stuff behind that we would go into if we had more time. But let me tell you just a few stories about some of the pioneers in this field who have essentially built self-sufficiency nonprofits. The basement of a church in 1978 in Miami. There's a minister there, and he's approached by a member of his congregation who says, my father is dying. He's in the last few months of his life. It's a terribly undignified process. They've got him hooked up to every device possible, doing all these things. Isn't there a better way? One of the members of the congregation was a registered nurse, Esther Cauliflower, and she had heard about this new thing that had just come to the U.S. recently from the UK called hospice care. It was taking place up at Yale University and a little bit around New Haven, and that was about it. Well, what she and Reverend Hugh Westbrook did was put a bed in the basement of the church for this one elderly man and surrounded him with caring individuals, his family, his personal doctor, a therapist, a minister, which Hugh served in that role, and began to focus on palliative care, not curative care. Pretty soon the basement was full of beds. And then they realized they couldn't really create a business or a nonprofit or anything that could depend on hospice care being delivered directly by them in their own facilities. So they invented home hospice care. And then they wrote the legislation for the state of Florida that would reimburse for home hospice care. And then they wrote the legislation for the federal government that would reimburse for home hospice care. All of that in a span of about 6 or 7 years. And they really had a strong nonprofit organization. They then wanted to expand to other states. So they went to a venture capitalist who was willing to give them the money if they converted to for-profit status. So they did that. He gave them the money, and then the founders were dismayed because the investor took the company off in a single bottom line direction, just to try to make as much money as he could. And the three of them sat down, hunkered down, and gradually bought back the company. It took them 3 years. And set the business out on a double bottom line path, social impact and financial viability in balance, in appropriate balance. Continued to grow the company. Today it's the largest provider of end-of-life care in the United States, Vitas Innovative Hospice Care. It's a $700 million business. It serves more than 11,000 people every day, more than 60,000 people total every year, starting from one bed in the basement of a church. In 1964, a man named John Durand, 32 years old, a Korean War veteran, had worked for 10 years when he got back from the war and then went back to get an engineering degree. He finally got the degree. He had a job offer. He accepted it at Bendix for $8,000 a year. Not a bad salary for 1964. And then his advisor called him in and said, "John, could you do me a favor?" And John said, "Well, sure," because the guy had been really helpful to him. He said, "John, I need you to go take an interview." And John said, but I already have a job. And the advisor said, "No, you're not listening, John. I said I want you to go take an interview. I didn't tell you you have to take a job. But there's this Catholic nun over at the Archdiocese of St. Paul who keeps calling me, wanting me to send over some of my graduates so she can interview them. And she's an old friend, and I need to get her off my back, so would you please go take the interview?" So John said, "Sure, I'll do it as a favor." So he went over there, and he told me the story years later. He said, "I went into the Archdiocese. They sent me down the hall to this nun's office. The door was locked, so I knocked on the door, and I heard a voice say, 'Come in.' I opened the door and walked in, and I knew I was in trouble, because the nun sitting behind the desk was the nun who had taught me piano lessons 20 years before. And she walked me over and sat me down, and she said, 'Young man, I want 3 years of your life.'" He said it was like a blue fog descended on him. And he had to go home and tell his wife that night he'd accepted a job for $4,000 instead of $8,000. What she wanted him to do was to start a high school for children who were developmentally disabled, who didn't have any educational opportunities. So he did that. And he hung around for 4 years. And he did a great job of it. And Sister Anne Marie called him back in and said, "Well, John, you got the high school, the kids are graduating, but now what happens to them? There's no place for them to go. If they're lucky, there's an intact family that can take care of them, but I think the divorce rate was like 72% for parents of developmentally disabled kids at that point." So John said, "Well, I think maybe I could create maybe a business that could employ some of these people." She said, "Really?" He said, "I think I could." So he went to the Archbishop and he said, "I need some money to start this thing." He said, "How much do you need?" He said, $100. "I have to incorporate, I have to buy a circular saw and a sewing machine." So he did that, and he took 14 young adults, 7 who were men, 7 who were women, and started what became a sheltered workshop called Opportunity Training Workshop. I don't know if you know what a sheltered workshop is, because it's sort of outmoded today, but it was a place where you brought people who were developmentally disabled, psychiatrically challenged, physically challenged, whatever the case might be, and you put them into a room and you had them do a little bit of work. That was about it. But within 5 years, they had 200 people in that sheltered workshop. John was pretty chuffed about it and decided he'd take a sabbatical and visit some other sheltered workshops in Canada and the U.S., and he did. He went to every one, and he got increasingly depressed, because every place he went, he saw the same thing. He saw people doing make work. It wasn't real work. There was no market for it. And they were only working 8 or 10 hours a week, and they were only getting paid 50 cents or $1 an hour, just like back at his place. And he knew he had to change something. So he went back to St. Paul, And he took his 11 social workers who were supervising these 200 people, and he took them out to dinner at the nicest hotel in St. Paul. He fed them, he sat them down, and he fired all 11 of them. And then he passed out application blanks. He said, starting tomorrow morning, we're not a rehab center anymore. We're a small business. And starting tomorrow morning, we don't have clients. We have employees. And starting tomorrow morning, we're not social workers. We're business managers. And if you can get your mind and your heart and your soul around that, I want you back. Otherwise, I'm not going to outplace you tonight, but I'm going to outplace you within the next 90 days. 2 people left. They couldn't accept that approach. 9 people came back. 4 of them later went and started similar organizations. What John had invented is something we know of today as an affirmative business. An affirmative business does 4 things for the members of a target population: real jobs, competitive wages, career tracks, and even ownership in the business. Today, there are roughly 50 of these affirmative businesses across the United States that are generating annual sales of more than $20 million. They employ ex-convicts. They employ people who are psychiatrically challenged. They employ people who are developmentally disabled. They employ single mothers who've come off of welfare. All kinds of different populations who are invisible to the American economy otherwise. They're not even on the unemployment rolls. But there are hundreds of thousands of these people across the United States. It moved to the United Kingdom in the late 90s. There were only 6 of these kinds of businesses in the UK in 1998. They're called social firms in the UK. Today there are 177 spread across the UK. When John Durand retired from what became Minnesota Diversified Industries in 1997, it was a $68.5 million business. 97% of his money came from earned revenue. He employed more than 1,000 people, 600 of whom were developmentally disabled, and had contracts with more than 50 corporations and the U.S. government to do the work. In 1971, Mimi Silbert and her 2 sons, who were 10 years old, and 11 ex-convicts moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. And they created something which came to be known as the Delancey Street Foundation. Today, the Delancey Street Foundation runs a dozen different businesses and has migrated more than 14,000 former prisoners, prostitutes, and drug addicts back into mainstream society. These people come to Delancey Street, and they work in at least 3 of the businesses during their 2 to 4 years at Delancey Street. And they teach each other both life skills and work skills. The only person in the entire organization who doesn't come from one of those 3 backgrounds is Mimi herself. Everybody else has graduated up into staff positions, and they've spun off similar organizations in North Carolina and elsewhere. They've never taken $1 of government money. They never took $1 of contributed money. Everything they did was funded by the profits from the businesses that they've developed over the years. These stories go on. There are 20 or 30 really iconic stories. Those were just 3 of them that those of us in the field talk about a lot because they were the pioneers who came along in the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s before things really began to change in the nonprofit sector. And those of us who've been in the sector, this social enterprise world, for 25 and 30 years or more, as I have been, are amazed at what's happening today. Because social entrepreneurship writ large has become probably the most energizing force in the nonprofit sector worldwide. Even 5 years ago, that was not the case. 10 years ago, it was just getting onto the radar screen. 30 years ago, nobody had heard anything about it. Social entrepreneurship is really a combination of 2 things: social innovation and social enterprise. How many of you know about something called the Ashoka Foundation? Fair number of you do. Good. The Ashoka Foundation in more than 60 countries in the last 25 to 30 years has helped more than 1,800 people start new organizations. They search out individuals who have systemic changing ideas and the skills to carry them out, and they surround them with resources and help them do that. They are entitled on their letterhead, Ashoka Innovators for the Public. Because what they're really looking for are people who have innovations that can change the world. Some of those people, as they move along the path, realize that they need to become sustainable in different ways, and they begin to adopt earned revenue strategies. And some of them actually start social enterprises that become self-sufficient. Essentially, innovation and enterprise exist along a continuum. Not every innovator becomes an enterpriser, but every enterpriser has had an innovative enlightenment, if you will, that gave them an idea that there was a business idea that could match social impact with financial viability, and we could help to change the world with that. So here at the Heinz College, I teach something called the Social Enterprise Incubator. Right now we have 14 students in that class. 2 of the women are working on one business idea, and the other 12 are working on each of their own. We've got 13 students actually developing social enterprises in that incubator right now. And we're seeing it happen at other colleges and universities around the United States. Just a few years ago, there were only 3 or 4 universities that did anything around this. And in fact, 3 of them were doing it because the same guy had gone from one college to the next. A guy named Greg Dees helped start this at Harvard, then he went to Stanford, then he went to Duke, and he's doing it at all of those places. Today there are more than 40 colleges and universities that are offering at least courses, if not certificates or degree programs. And worldwide it's beginning to spread as well. The Skoll Forum at Oxford began in 2004, an annual event bringing together social entrepreneurs from all over the world. They sell out every available lodging space in Oxford every year. So they've never been able to get more than 750 people to come to this. They could easily get 2,000 or more if they were to move it to another venue. The Social Enterprise Alliance here in the United States, which I helped co-found 11 years ago, will have its 10th summit in New Orleans next spring, and we'll have more than 700 people there. It's more of a focus on the practitioners at that event, whereas the ones at the Skoll Forum are more the innovators and the academics. So there's a dividing line in a certain respect, but some overlap. The first World Forum on Social Enterprise took place in Scotland 2 months ago. The second one will be in Australia next year, the third one in San Francisco, and then we're going to go to 2 other continents in subsequent years beyond that. An organization called NEST has been working in Central Europe and South America for the last 15 years, helping NGOs start social enterprises in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Chile and Peru and other countries in the Stans, the Kazakhstans of the world. We have people in Singapore who have launched these kinds of endeavors in a very significant way. It's happening all over the place. And it's happening not just with existing nonprofits. It's continuing to happen in the private sector as well. And it's starting to happen among people like you, who are coming out of your colleges and universities here and leaping right into the middle of this social enterprise world, where you address social needs with the businesses that you create directly. It's not corporate social responsibility. That's a wonderful thing, but that's an indirect approach to social needs, using environmentally friendly products or setting up a foundation or paying equitable wages. Those are all wonderful things, but that's an indirect approach to the social needs. The businesses I'm talking about are a direct attack on these needs. I chair an international organization called SAGE, Students for the Advancement of Global Entrepreneurship. These are high school students in 15 countries. Every fall, they actually start businesses and run them during the school year. They have some global element in the business, and then they have state, national, and international competitions through the summer. We had our international competition in Nigeria this past summer. The previous year, the international winners were a group of 12-year-olds from Nigeria. I mean, it's an astonishing thing for me to walk into the room and speak to 300 of these high school kids from all over the world. And they're all looking at me with eyes as large as you can imagine. And the excitement is palpable because they have an understanding that they can make a difference. They've seen a path laid out for them. I have no idea how they'll walk down that path or what they'll do. And I tell my students in the incubator here, I don't know if any of you are actually going to start these businesses, but you're going to have windows opened of opportunity, just like I was trying to open for those boys in India 35 years ago. So social enterprise, for me, has become a life's mission. And it is so gratifying, 40 years later, to see people like you, even those of you who are required to come to this lecture, listening to what I'm saying, thinking about how you can change the world. Because you can. You people are my heroes. You're the ones who can pick up what we've attempted to start and take it into new directions that we can't even imagine right now. The opportunities are immense for you to have an impact. Starting in the basement of a church, starting with $100 from an archbishop, starting in a one-bedroom apartment with a dozen occupants. Wherever you start, who knows where it's going to lead you? So that you're going to be standing up here in 5 and 10 and 20 and 40 years telling people how you did it. And for me, there's nothing more gratifying than seeing people like you make it happen. You're the next generation of leaders. It's up to you. We've placed the world in your hands. Those of us who came out of a pre-boomer generation. I mean, I'm not done yet. I don't mean to imply that. But you are the guys who have the time, the resources, the energy, the desire to do this. People like me are here to try to help you if we can. To try to send you